Okay, so delighted to get started on this second day. Yesterday we kicked off the conference under the theme Tools for Unknown Futures by looking in the morning at platforms and platform builders in government, among citizen groups and industry. And then we turned to speculative design and design fictions to explore how these are rewiring society at a really deep level. We ended on cities. Cities has been a recurring theme for FutureEverything, which is no accident. Many interesting things happen at city scale, and much of the data that actually touches people's lives is held at city scale. This morning, we've got two great sessions to kick off, back to back. The second one is called the data economy. And that's looking at these next generation platforms that are really built on open data, ubiquitous open data, and looking at the economic models that can sustain them. We're still at a point where, on one sense, it feels a little bit like a gold rush territory, and another, we're waiting for things to emerge. Last night, we saw presentations of some of the best innovations that are coming out using open data, that small businesses are using, really pioneering, developing really great ideas that turn data into meaningful services, that takes that and connects it to people's lives. But we need the economic models, and there's some really interesting work around that to make that sustainable. The other aspect of this morning is around cities. And there's some really deep questions that come out of this space about what this means for citizens, what it means for local government. And that's very much the focus of this first session, City API. We have three people who are all at the front line, leading thinkers and practitioners in this space. Katalin Gallyas from Amsterdam, who is involved in the Amsterdam edition of a project we introduced yesterday to Manchester and many other things. Dan Hill, who gave our keynote last year, so we're delighted to welcome back, who we shall hear has returned to the UK in a new guise and with a new responsibility for this area of future cities. And to open the session, Emer Coleman, who has been an ally and a collaborator of FutureEverything for many years. Emer set up London Data Store, and I think it's fair to say that when FutureEverything was working on open data in 2009, Emer was really the key champion of our work. She got what we were doing and was someone who really stood shoulder to shoulder with us and really supported us in taking that project forward in Manchester. And Emer has since joined the board of directors of FutureEverything. So I'm delighted now to have the opportunity to work with her more closely, and especially delighted to welcome her to give the opening talk of this session. Emer.
Thanks very much for that, Drew. So a couple of weeks ago I wrote a blog called The City as a Platform, Stripping Out Complexity to Make Things Happen, because I was getting a little frustrated with the whole lack of movement, really, or what I perceive as a lack of movement at UK city level in terms of opening data. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today, why it is that I think that the progress towards open data at a city level in the UK has not progressed as quickly as it should. And just to look at that in a policy context, when I started working for the Mayor to set up the London Data Store, my knowledge was really, really small at that time, so I didn't know what an API was. And also I was scrambling around in policy terms to really try and understand, well, what is open data? What does it mean? And I remember a friend of mine, Chris Taggart, emailing me, and he said, look, I found this. It's the 3 laws of open government data, which had been articulated by a Canadian open data activist called David Eves. And I still think it remains one of the most elegant descriptions of what open data is. And Eves said, if it can't be spidered or indexed, it doesn't exist. If it isn't available, open, and in machine-readable format, it can't engage. And if a legal framework doesn't allow it to be repurposed, it doesn't empower. And that was a really simple set of principles which, we worked on in London, and that was what we used when we talked to agencies about saying, this is why it needs to be machine readable. This is why you need to have commercial reuse and proper licensing. And so that was, when you think about it, 5 years ago. And we've come a huge distance in the UK since then. So we've had, white papers, we've had tremendous central government commitment to the release of open data. We've seen, huge growth in the data sets in data.gov. We've seen the release of all of our public sector transport. And of course, we have now the wonderful Open Data Institute in London, where I'm really fortunate to work 3 days a week. And so that's a very significant growth in policy terms in the last 5 years. So the question I'm asking is, why are we still dancing like it's 2009? Okay, so we kind of know the policy end of it. Why hasn't there been the kind of movement that you would expect right across the UK in terms of opening data? And I was really delighted a couple of months ago to come across a book written by Adam Greenfield, who spoke here yesterday at one of the Fireside Chats, because it answered for me. It was like one of those eureka moments when you read a book and you say, that's why it's not happening. And so he talks about the rhetoric of the smart city, barely existing outside the rhetorical productions of actors already profoundly committed to market-based conceptions of the good. And of course, what he's describing there is a smart city narrative that we all know from the Siemens and the Ciscos and the IBMs and all of those large corporations already in proprietary relationships, often with the cities that they're trying to engage with. But essentially, what that smart city rhetoric talks about is a turnkey solution for cities, as if we can go in and massively and easily suck in all of our city data, everything from citizens to sensors, and produce something that makes rational sense, which will drive down the cost of public service delivery and might also have a little bit of surveillance involved. But it's a very rational based approach to it. And I'm not sure if you'll all be able to read this, but I thought if you were to try and articulate that in some sort of schema, what does that look like? What does the smart city look like, as opposed to something we might describe as near future cities or citizen-centric cities? And if you look at the problem-solving approaches in that smart city rhetoric, it's very technical. It's all about known solutions, right, to problems, known solutions we can implement, rather than what it's like in the real world, which is adaptive. We have adaptive problems. They're new to us. We don't have answers to them, and so we've got to find different ways of resolving them. The philosophical approach to that is strategic. We will take strategic action. This is a strategic action for the city, rather than looking at what Jürgen Habermas talks about as the life world. The life world where we need to reach consensus with each other about the best way to move forward, something he calls communicative action. The urban design approach in a smart city is engineered. It's rational, it's hard-edged. It's not about the shared spaces that we share all the time, the beautiful square outside this building, the decisions that we make as citizens as to how we navigate around our world. In information technology terms, it's proprietary rather than open source. And the communicative style is broadcast, telling you what's right for you, telling you how you should behave in the city, using a command and control version to do that, as opposed to one that's interactive and that's about engagement. And of course, the approach to transparency is highly contextualized. We gather the data, we interpret the data, and we tell you what that data says about you, and we ask you to make different decisions based on our interpretation of that data, where a more open approach would be to look at that as raw data. And the reason I use this schema is because I have used this for many years in government. Only the words that say smart cities used to say NPM for new public management, and the column that says near future cities used to say open governance. Because actually the smart city framework, as it's articulated in that rhetoric, fits very well with the approach of local government, right? Which has always been, a new public management approach, very rigid. So a turnkey solution to the city, wow, that sounds like amazing, right? And you can see why local authorities would believe in that perfection. But the truth is, the technological issues, the governance issues, the kind of stakeholder players, the legacy systems that exist are never going to allow that happen, certainly not in the near term. So we have to find different solutions if we want to look at what a near future city might look like. And we have had players in that space for many years. There's some wonderful work done by Tom Armitage, where he has, citizens engaging with physical objects in their city. And this isn't done, with smartphone, really, top-end technology. It's done with your basic brick phone on text, right? And those playful ways about how we can get citizens to engage with the city in a more meaningful way. Or the work of Toby Barnes and Mudlark, who developed a game several years ago called Chroma, which basically used your Oyster pay-as-you-go data, and it allowed you to join teams, to capture stations. It was all about making the commute to work fun. And for any of you who work in large cities, you understand that commuting is a core part of your life, and anything that can make that easier or better or fun, or can challenge you to maybe stop one stop early and walk the rest of the distance, has great implications for behavior change. Or we look at the evolution, right back to the London riots, where citizens surge forward when a city is in crisis to express their love for that place. So this guy who set up Riot Cleanup, had 49 or 40,000 followers within hours, right? I was in City Hall during the time of the protests, and we tried in the GLA to say to him, hey, if you want us to give you any help, come in and talk to us, because he had people, saying, we want to do something for London. And he needed to allocate them. Here's one guy, all of a sudden attracting this number of people. So we've had, this idea of crowdsourced and citizen-centered and citizen-entered data and information is not new. But as we thought would happen in 2009 when we started agitating for the release of open data, basically on an emergent speculation, because people used to say to me, what's the ROI? And I'm going, I don't know. And I don't know is never a good answer for government, right? Because they get a bit nervous around that. So I'm very glad to see that there is now an emergent market of open technologies, which I think is very important, because we want to avoid the kind of lock-in that our institutions have been bedeviled by for so long. And I'm part of that emergent market myself. People like Carbon Culture, developing agile platforms which can help local authorities and cities reduce their data. But the important word you see there is together, right? So we need to do this together. Companies like Mastodon C doing fantastic work around prescription analytics, where they're looking at how much money the NHS could have saved by using statins and generic drugs rather than pharmaceutical branded drugs. So using this Open Data Transport API, which is my company, which provides a RESTful API for all of the UK's public transport data, which is used by over 600 developers, SMEs and companies to integrate open transport data into their various digital offerings. US entrants that are coming into the market, Socrata, who provide a turnkey solution that's lightweight and avoids lock-in to give you an immediate data store. Or emerging companies like Stat.io, based in London, who provide embeddable widgets that will quickly allow you to visualize your data. So Drupal, another startup in the States that's providing Drupal plus what they're calling DCAM. So these are all very lightweight solutions. So, it's easy. It's easier now than it ever was to make your data open. Even if you don't have the full technology capability in-house, there are easy and agile and lightweight products. And the last section of what I'd like to say is, that's why I'm saying you are not an API. So the whole discussion about, we are sensors now. We provide our information. In the smart city rhetoric, is that just all collected without any conversation with us, without any explanation of what that data is going to be used for? On the other hand, do I decide I am a sensor? I may choose at some time in the future to give my data to the city, to provide environmental data in real time for them, because I want to do a public service. But also in the future of cryptocurrencies, are we looking at a stage where I might be paid for my contribution in micro-licensing terms? Because we are also, having to look at what is the contribution cities are going to make to building people's livelihoods in a digital economy. Is all the benefit going to accrue to those at the top? So you look at Instagram. Instagram sold for millions and millions, and 13 employees benefit from that. Well, I'm not getting a share in Instagram, am I? But yet I've contributed to the added value of that product. And these are the questions we're going to answer. But what I would say is, we're not even at the point where we could even envisage a cryptocurrency engagement with the local authority if they can't even upload CSV files. So my point is, the more things change, the more they stay the same, because this is the battle that was raging between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses in the States in the 60s. Only now it's digital, okay? She was arguing for a grassroots, bottom-up approach. He was an urban planner looking at linear organization of the city. So, plus ça change. My call to local authorities, therefore, is go ugly early and stop letting perfection be the enemy of the good. We are where we are, and we need to start where we are, and we need to do it. And that's basically what my blog said. It said, just do it. And the last thing I would like to say is, I was very struck yesterday by Adam Greenfield in his Fireside Chat, who made a comment that the life of our sidewalks are negotiations. And it reminded me very much of a video I'm just about to show you, which many of you will have seen, but it really encapsulated for me what it is to be human in the city. To be able to express joy even in the constraints of a sidewalk, and to be able to do that with grace and courtesy for the other fellow citizens who are passing by. And for me, it's the kind of human, citizen-centric city that will never be captured by the turnkey solution of a smart city.
Sitting up by my window, watching the summer rain. The world goes by in a minute faster than I can keep up with today. Everybody in the place say what now? Your soul's feeling shut down, locks out. But you gotta carry on, speed it up now. Whoa, 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 whoa. Knock down. Everybody in the place say what now? Your soul's feeling shut down, locks out. But you gotta carry on, speed it up now. Ooh, yeah, I got the feeling that something could happen now. Yeah, I got the feeling that something might happen inside my love now. And have you ever asked why you feel like you've been here before? 'Cause only you have the power to carry on through that door. Everybody in the place say what now? Your soul's feeling shut down, locks out. But you gotta carry on, speed it up now. Whoa, 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 whoa. Knock down. Everybody in the place say what now? Your soul's feeling shut down, locks out. But you gotta carry on, speed it up now. So when you're up, go get on up. Go get on up, don't give it up, no. Whoa, steady up, don't dig it up. Go when you're up, don't dig it up, no. So when you're up, go get on up. Go get on up, don't give it up, no. Whoa, steady up, don't dig it up. Go when you're up, don't dig it up, no. Knock down. Everybody in the place say what now? Your soul's feeling shut down, locks out. But you gotta carry on, speed it up now. Whoa, 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 whoa. Knock down. Everybody in the place say what now? Your soul's feeling shut down, locks out. But you gotta carry on, speed it up now. It's time to put it on. Don't ever turn it on. Yeah, you know I got the feeling that something's gonna happen. Now you know that I'm a feeling. You're feeling shut down, bodies that you lucked out. I'm on a level that they really can't go. Just shout out. Never ask why you've been there before. Gotta have the power to go through that door. You gotta know yourself, need to be sure. Now what you waiting for? Knock down. Everybody in the place say what now? Your soul's feeling shut down, locked down. But you gotta carry on, speed it up now. Whoa, 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 whoa. Knock down. Everybody in the place say what now? Your soul's feeling shut down, locked down. But you gotta carry on, speed it up now.
Thank you.
So how do I follow that? I won't dance, that's for sure. Thank you, Emer, that was great. So it's full circle for me, funnily enough, in that, as Drew said, I'm back in the UK now, but also this is where my first job was, in this town hall. I was a senior officer, brackets IT, equal opportunities group. And I worked up there somewhere on the third or fourth floor. So, and I remember getting into trouble for typing my own memos on the computer because it would put the typing pool out of business. And in the basement here, there was a typing pool. And I'm old, but I'm not that old. But it kind of shows how city government has changed in very visceral ways around what we used to call IT, and hopefully we don't call IT much anymore. So the other reason it's full circle for me is I'm back in the UK working at the Future Cities Catapult, which is a new organisation based in the UK, looking at how do we connect people together to do integrated city projects, the kind of projects that aren't happening, the kind of projects that Emer talked about not happening. And I'll mention that a little bit. So Emer set up the smart city idea very nicely indeed. And we know that in some way it's to do with this notion of pulling data from the way the city is performing in new ways. And we can begin to understand that our infrastructure might be something we can see performing, not just existing as a series of drawings on a plan, but actually something producing real-time feeds of data one way or another around cities, building, places, the way that people interact with them, the way that traffic moves, and so on. I should actually credit that. I stole that video from a Spanish TV advert about 5 years ago. I think it was Telefonica, I'm not sure. So apologies to them. But kind of more interestingly, perhaps, running alongside that, we can also see how citizens are getting involved in sensing the city. This is me sensing the amount of dirt on some snow in Helsinki. The dirt was coal dust from this. And that dark bit to the right, there isn't a shadow, that's just the coal dust falling off the ship. That's the way the wind is blowing. And you can see the snow to the left there. The nice thing about Helsinki is it enables you to do kind of data visualization in the snow like that, around coal dust. So I was inspired slightly by Usman Haque's work here in terms of how people can understand things like air quality, not necessarily through precise scientific instruments or even air quality eggs, but just by running your finger along a windowsill and recording that in some way. So there's data being produced all over the place in different ways. And last year I talked about this idea of smart citizens, that citizens are getting more involved in and understanding and activating the city, if you like. Whether that's more than it used to be or less than it used to be, I don't know, but it feels like there's certainly a cultural shift in the last few years, enabled, not driven by, but enabled in part by the internet, I think. And last year I spoke with a very gravelly voice about this kind of thing. Ravintolapäivä in Helsinki, which is a restaurant day, which is a pop-up restaurant day organized by the citizens of the city, basically 3 people who were so frustrated by how long it took to open up a cafe, how many regulations you had to go through, that they just decided to say, well, let's just all open a cafe out of our front rooms. And that lady up there in the front room is making bacon and egg muffins and lowering them to the street. And people are putting €5, or it probably is €5 because it's Helsinki, into the basket and getting a bacon and egg muffin in return. And the entire city comes alive on days like this. Now, this now runs every 4 months. And to be clear, it's totally illegal, as in she has no license to make food in her kitchen and sell it on the street like that. Any more than this is an Argentinian woman who was living around the corner from where I lived. She was making empanadas, and there's a human empanada in the foreground there, advertising what's going on, which is fairly unbeatable, I think, as a marketing strategy, but also shows how when citizens want to do something, it's this unbelievable force. Someone will dress as an empanada all day in order to advertise their friend's place upstairs. And so there's this kind of exchange going on now in cities. This is a Thai soup kitchen in the park, again, completely illegal. And there's nothing the city could do about this because it was done en masse and organized in an emergent fashion. So there was no organization behind it. There was a kind of a sheer force of will and using some off-the-shelf tools, even more off-the-shelf than the ones Emer talked about, like Facebook and Twitter, were able to organize this whole thing. So there was no one in a way for the city to arrest, except everybody. And so they couldn't. And then, like I said, the city comes alive on days like this. These are French students selling crepes in the streets. These are Finnish girls selling quiches, I seem to remember. This is a largely defunct kiosk, which was open on this day. It's usually defunct, and the reason it's not open is that there's a 4-year leasing requirement on this thing. So in order to get in there and start something up, you have to sign up for 4 years. I think it was 4 years, maybe 3. Either way, it's not 2 weeks, which is probably what it should be, or 2 months, perhaps more realistically. Because if you have a hunch that you might start something up there, how can you possibly commit to 4 years rent? If you're an entrepreneur and you think, maybe I could sell espresso from there, and I walk past every day wanting someone to sell espresso, and I should have probably been that person. But it was open on restaurant day because restaurant day found a way, using a kind of a new practice of unlocking aspects of the city that regulation had inhibited. So, in a funny way, city governments now have perhaps direct competition, maybe for the first time in 200 years or so, since the idea of the municipality, the municipal government, emerges, post-Enlightenment and all of that. There is a competition as a platform for deciding what happens in your city. even the delivery of some services. So Ravintila Restaurant Day was organized using Facebook again, and this is kind of a weapons-grade tool for organizing and making things happen. City councils, as Emer pointed out, are not from that background. They don't have that kind of toolkit, unless they also use Facebook, of course, which is an entirely pragmatic thing to do. They also built 4 mobile apps in a 3-day hackathon, 4 different mobile platforms. This is the one on the iPhone, I seem to think, yep. And on the left, it shows you the scale of Restaurant Day. All of those little black chevrons is a pop-up restaurant, basically. And by pop-up restaurant, it literally can mean a table outside someone's front room, all the way through to something really gourmet, actually. And part of that, again, as I spoke about last year, I'm not going to dwell on this, is that the way that city government and national government and government generally has been working in the West is an idea emerging from another time that has been updated and iterated a bit, but now feels sometimes out of step with the way that contemporary culture is. So Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State under Clinton, said the thing at the top. We have 21st century challenges, e.g. climate change, healthcare epidemics, obesity epidemics, air quality issues, all of these things that are actually complex, interdependent, what Rittel and Weber would call wicked problems. So we're taking 21st century challenges and evaluating the 20th century ideas and responding with 19th century tools. The quote from the bottom is from Cody Wilson, who produced the blueprints for the 3D printed gun, which is a project that you might like or hate. It usually splits people. But for me, the interesting thing about the project was about the regulatory aspect of it. How on earth do you regulate firearms in a context where someone could produce it at home or something equivalent to home? You know, the corner shop, for instance, if the corner shop's photocopiers get replaced with 3D printers in time. So, you can no longer license them in the same way. You don't have to go to the firearms vendor in quite the same way. So for him, it was about 20th century institutions versus 21st century implications. Either way, there's this clear tension now. The president of Estonia talks about this just in very simple terms, and Estonia kind of interesting test case for a lot of this stuff because they pushed a lot on this. And we know that in the 19th century government, in a way, was built on the fact that it was a paper processing engine. It was just built to handle vast amounts of paper because that was the medium of the day. We're still working in that mode, often. I believe in the Northeast there's a government building named after a form. It literally is, NH17432 or something, which is the name of the form that it processes. So there's a radical shifting towards digital, and again, I won't dwell on this because I talked about it last year, but we did some projects in Helsinki at Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, our strategic design unit there, looking at things like Brickstarter, which was a kind of a sketch, a design probe, if you like, working with the city of Helsinki to think, well, what if you didn't use paper for planning, for instance? You're able to produce something in collaboration with citizens. Importantly, the city was still at the heart of it, and there still was a planning process, and there were still architects. I think that's the interesting thing. We don't throw everything away and switch straight over to an emergent condition, because it's difficult to see how an emergent condition like crowdsourcing multiplied by social media will generate something like a public hospital at the scale we need to, even if we think of public hospital as a distributed series of pop-in centres, which we probably should. It's difficult to make the case at the moment for light rail and things like that being generated, those broader public goods. But certainly it can do things like Ravintila, possibly it can do waste collection better than we currently could. So when can we use this and when can't is something we need to test through prototypes. Because the day after Restaurant Day, the kiosk snapped back into that mode because the regulation hadn't changed. And for all I know, it's probably still a 3-year lease to get into that building in Helsinki. So that's what it looks like most of the time. Now, the institution, as the long-term arbiter of public good in the city, working with citizens, is the only thing that's there in the long term. Corporations come and go, social innovation agencies come and go. FutureEverything's been around a long time, but at some point it might not be, I don't know. I hope it lasts forever, but anyway, we'll see. This is the thing. The city is the thing that's there in the long run. It's the only thing with that kind of long-term agency at the moment, until we come up with something better and there's nothing on the table. So the problem with the pop-up culture is that they pop down again. The problem with the tinkering culture is it doesn't generate, again, the equivalent condition of a public healthcare system at the moment. And we don't know how emergent structures scale, whether they can at all to do some things. We know they're extremely good at other things, so let's start picking these things apart. I'd argue we still need those institutions, they just need to be completely redesigned. So that's the challenge ahead of us one way or another. We know that they're in the wrong mode, actually, for the time we're living in. There are all kinds of open questions about what mode we might wish them to be in. Absolutely no consensus about that whatsoever. And it's radically different from Helsinki to Manchester, obviously. So there won't be a one-size-fits-all thing, which again goes back to the problem that Emer pointed out around the idea of turnkey solutions around smart cities. Cities are radically different. Neighborhoods are radically different. Yes, they have similar things, similar looking things like trams and things, but the conditions that produce those trams are totally different. But working with citizens can give you a sense of possibility in that working with citizens gives you legitimacy. If we're talking about democratic cities, let's assume we are, we're not always talking about that, but let's assume we are, you need citizens to be involved in wanting those things to happen. That has also been a problem with the smart city movement. No one has managed to explain to citizens what's in it for them. Why make all of this stuff happen if it's so important? Explain it to me. We don't have those good answers yet. If we can, and I'd argue it's more to do with getting to the nub of what cities are about, genuinely delivering city services or producing a different kind of city, then maybe we get somewhere. But that hasn't been the argument so far. So we'd get some legitimacy from doing this in collaboration. We'd also get some momentum, because if you get citizens on board, if it's their idea in the first place, things move a lot quicker. If you're trying to sell something to them and through consultation, then it can easily generate a NIMBY response and not in my backyard response. So talk about some of the practice here. I take great hope from things that Emer and others have been involved in, like government digital service in the Cabinet Office. Again, whole separate conversation about the good and the bad within that. I largely think what's super interesting is the practice, the way they've been able to generate a practice within the heart of something that you would have thought was the last place you could do that, the Cabinet Office of the UK government. They've been able to produce something which moves at pace, delivering better public services for less money, radically less money, hundreds of millions of pounds cheaper, and better services. That's an unbeatable hand, particularly that when cities are facing dropping revenue and increasing demands on that. I believe there's a graph which shows that public health care and social care costs reach a certain point. They're going up all the time in cities like Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, etc., and spending is going down. That crosses over in 2019. So there is not enough money in 2019, I think it's 2017 in Liverpool, to be able to continue to pay for the services that some families need in the cities. So we have to address this public sector reform issue using new thinking and new practice. There's no question about that. GDS shows one aspect of that. It doesn't get to the nub of the healthcare, social care thing I just described, because that's actually to do with not just delivery but policy as well. And that's, I think, arguably an interesting next step for projects like this one. But the way that that's working is interesting. So again, and to follow from what Emer was saying, the kind of just-do-it approach of getting something out there and then iterating, which is natural to certain innovation cultures, if we can call them that, is completely different to the way that city councils have been working, which is strategic and about planning. Planning is nonsense largely in most urban projects. And I don't just mean planning projects, I mean generally strategy in that. And Roger Martin and Harvard Business Review, even in Harvard Business Review, they talk about the big lie of strategic planning. I'm much more interested in different ways of thinking about it. So this is an Italian architect, Giancarlo De Carlo, who did a lot of work around public collaboration. And he talks about when making a building, his idea was that you'd have this scaffolding, and you'd build the scaffolding by climbing up there and placing things into place in the place that they felt right and taking them away where they wouldn't. And so you'd collaboratively produce this structure by going up with the builders and the engineers simultaneously. legible practice. It's very difficult for governments and city governments to talk in clear ways about what they're doing so that others can pick it up and copy it. And that's something we did a lot in Helsinki, and wrote a book about legible practices, about how getting things done in government can happen. And it covered GDS as a case study alongside some others. But there's a certain, there's a way of working in public which is important, I think, in this context, which isn't often done. So this was my sketch in my notebook for Brickstarter, the thing that I showed you earlier, and we published all of this stuff online as we were doing it. And it's still difficult to see cities doing that in a useful, productive way, to talk about the design decisions that were at play, enable others to copy it, enable others to adapt it, mutate it, tinker with it, and so on. So all of that's the kind of the communication aspect of that. Not communication as marketing, but communication as in this is how we're doing a project. These are the decisions we're making. What do you think about that? That's very different. And there's no genuine reason why I think actually cities couldn't work that way. There are very pragmatic reasons, which Emer just described, which she's very convincing about, to show that right now it's very difficult for city councils to work in the way that we just been imagining. They really do not have the people, the skills, the culture, and the background for that en masse. It's been driven out of local government. But technically, moving forward in the future, there is no way that it needn't be like that, basically. GDS illustrates that you can do that even at the heart of the cabinet office, which is hardly an innovation culture. So technically, there's no reason why not. There's a question about, well, how much do we do inside, how much do we do outside? That's a very interesting thing for debate. But either way, I think it relies on this idea of understanding citizens can be active. Not all the time, not everybody wants to be active all the time, but government needs to match that. And so metaphors like shared space are interesting because they work as an individual. See, there's barely any signs around this intersection, effectively no signs. This is the safest way you design an intersection. This is in the Netherlands, where shared space was kind of systematized. And it works because everybody's paying attention. They're all active participants in producing that condition. That's the guy that invented it.
So what was here before?
Or systematized it, Hans Monderman. It's actually, of course, how cities have worked for centuries before the last 100 years of transport engineering and transport planning. So that condition of an individual working within a system but aware of themselves as part of a system and their implication and their interactions with the system is a nice metaphor for thinking about the way that we could work with citizens in a different way. So those things are designed to be participative. They're designed on the condition that citizens are active, and yet they also involve planning, design, architecture, all of that, what you might call top-down bureaucratic organizational stuff as well. But it produces that condition, which is interesting. At the Catapult, we're just thinking about how do we organize these different things. I won't go into this in detail, it's super sketchy, but we're talking about how do you start picking apart these different aspects of a city from a data point of view so that you understand how decisions made at the infrastructural layer might impact the engagement with citizens, with developers, with strategic insight for municipalities. What are the different roles and responsibilities of people at different stages of that? What can be public, what can be private, and so on and so on. So we're just beginning to find the language for understanding this, and we're then looking forward to working with others, including many in this room, on taking that forward. Either way, I think it's in this interplay between these two that is the nub of where we take cities forward from a government and citizens' point of view. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I would like to actually elaborate on the thoughts of my previous speakers, what then also called the strategic, actually the big lie of strategic planning, and what Emer called actually also the very interesting thoughts of how to make cities as platform. So I'm actually from Amsterdam City Hall. I'm engaged in policy making since 7 years, and these are my employers. So you can see that it's very scattered. What I'm doing in my daily work is actually working for the City Hall in policy making connected to the economic department, where we try to attract investors, but we also think about how the city will be reshaped strategically and how to facilitate actually business, incubate business, create jobs. I'm also connected to Amsterdam Smart Cities, as Drew mentioned, with the Smart Citizen kit launching. It's a very exciting exercise, how to get citizens as sensors. But moreover, I'm engaged in European projects, Open Cities City SDK and Code for Europe, that are actually advocating the value of non-proprietary open systems and citizen participations, and to advocate the value of working with platforms. So what I'm doing actually, my daily work is connecting, and with half leg out of the city and with half leg in the business. So very often I'm talking to policymakers, how they perceive emergent technologies. I try to induce technology in city halls. I try to discuss what is future internet, what is participatory platforms. I connect a lot with the tech society. I go a lot to hackathons, app contests. I work passionately with innovation agencies because I think these are very important. They have very important pushing effect on city transformation, and I also very connected to smart, actually boot camps, startup accelerators. And in my work, I'm advocating for open data since 3 years, open innovation. This year in City of Amsterdam, we're making an open innovation program, also with committed local resources. I'm working also a lot to experiment with different forms of crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, working with civic commons, open source civic apps, and civic tech acceleration, because I think this is the future the cities have to tap into, and this is still undiscovered area. So I'm also dreaming of a city, how it looks like Blade Runner. I think it's very important to mention that we are entering an era where the cities have to be more adaptive. They have to be more transformative and participative and agile. And in my perception, we are currently not able to do that unless we are very well networked and connected. Because where we work in policy making, actually to me, even after 7 years, it still looks like a galaxy of governance. It's very dense, inaccessible very often, producing lots of papers, asking too little questions. And what I've noticed in my daily work, there is a very strong urge for actually defending the status quo. To creating a system that are actually maintaining the city governance as it used to be. There is a very strong advocacy for internal organization and also internal control. So that's very challenging for somebody who is promoting innovation. Also, if you work in city halls, even in Amsterdam, you see that we try to create the impression of cosmic complexity, that it's very difficult to access, and it's also even better because then we can execute our regular tasks. What I've noticed, it's also very regretful that we are just less receptive for emergent technologies, like big data, for example. There is so many things going on the market in business intelligence, in data mining, and it's very difficult to train city servants to be aware of this big change. What I've noticed also in policy making, even in thinking about economic strategic scenarios, how the city should look like in like 20 years, we tend to prefer internal meetings. And when I'm asking policymakers, so why didn't we crowdsource the policy? We don't know how the future is going to look like. They say that yes, we actually crowdsourced, but we crowdsourced it to a preferred group of very established thinkers, of big CEOs of big companies. So this is what I'm actually fighting against. You see in City Hall that we really strive for perfection. We really would like to have results done. and not to admit that some data sets are incomplete, the departure time of bus lines are actually not correct. We really like to look back, retrospective. It's very difficult to promote also open innovation because it's very much future-driven, chance-driven. We would like to have actually results that are already being done. It's very difficult to see how risk-averse decision makers are working in the City Hall. They really would like to have measurable results, and they would like to have, they like to repair things instead of create. And they really cherish preferred suppliers, and as I just mentioned before, I see many practices of pseudo outsource that is actually not outsourcing practice, but because they still work in a kind of thinking tank of big corporate suppliers. What I perceive in my daily work that actually citizens are digital pioneers. They run, they dynamic, they make use of future internet technology, whereas the city is a slow motion, oversized mammoth. What are the choices left for the cities? For the citizens, how can we access the city? Either we adapt to this kind of complexity and you became a kind of astronaut in this complex system, or a second way that I also prefer, that cities will open up. This is the Reichstag, just representing how important it is to be able to look inside the decision making. And that is what actually happens, in my eyes, best practice in Helsinki, where when you have city meetings, they already release all the decision-making documents through API. So let's see what will happen if we will open up, we will be more transformative and participative. I will show you some practice from Amsterdam. But we actually see that the city is an interface. Cities must launch new digital services. We are forced to do so because otherwise it's impossible to communicate with citizens. Our citizens, everybody knows that 24 hours connected, they are craving for immediate response, feedback. They want to co-create. But the city offers too little opportunities to co-create in digital services that are really relevant. When I'm talking about platforms and participatory government, I always get these questions, shall we insource, outsource, what does it cost? They don't think it as a radical change of working methodology. It's very often being seen as an extra layer of work. It requires extra capacity. When we try to do crowdsourcing, very often people are afraid of who is going to mediate with the social media, who is going to respond on behalf of the city to the crowd. That scares cities off. And also a very important question when we think about platforms, how to prevent that it's actually fading away after the implementation of a project. Very often you see that many platforms are being launched, but they very much just tied to the running period of a project, and then the maintenance is a big issue, therefore we have to be very careful with that. In my daily job, I very much like to quote policymakers because what I noticed that the tech society and the policymakers are speaking different vocabularies, and I think the future challenge for all of us is to mediate these two words and try to make each other understand to capture the best available technology. So this is when I'm talking about, when I'm promoting open data in Amsterdam and in many other cities, I really think that everybody feels that it's something very exciting will happen, but it's also scary because they don't know how to choose vendors, who are the best providers, what are the best operating systems. Everybody's asking me if I release the transport data sets that are the most required real-time, how many apps will be created, how many new jobs will be created, how many startups. They want to have this payoff effect and revenues that we can measure what our investment will lead to. And the most funny question, actually that can open data, repair market failure and inefficiency. This is also being asked during my quest for open innovation, open data. Because if you can say that you actually fix a market in failure, then they're more inclined to invest in open data. So actually, what I mentioned is participatory platforms are often experienced as an extra layer of work and unforeseen request extra budgets. And it's just a luxurious extra work. And I think this is a huge challenge to move out of this perception. What I've noticed is that there are many nice citizen participation platforms like Change Bias in New York, and I'm talking with them a lot, and we also would like to implement this in Amsterdam and in Helsinki, because it has a very nice user interface. It's very easy to put post-its and to share ideas. But what is very important about Change Bias is that catchy interface is just a start, because behind the catchy interface there is an orchestrating team that is actually connecting ideas, submitters to funding, to volunteers, to locations. So it's very important if we think about the city as platform to understand that we have to move out of this top-down service provider towards a more participatory, more platform-thinking government. The policy making is very paradoxal because we used to plan and quantify cities. We like to make top-down decisions, and on the other hand, you see the emergence of many, many platforms. So I would like to just go on with the participatory platforms and the lessons learned in Amsterdam so far. There are many, many market evidence because there are many platforms being launched in the last 3 years. Of course, Airbnb, or Peerby is to exchange some devices to us. Thuis Afgegaan is sharing neighborhood food and cooking. What we see actually, even in my department, we promote that we should make 10,000 new hotel rooms. However, Airbnb is picking up and many transactions are being made there, and it's actually almost substituting the 2- and 3-star hotels in Amsterdam right now. So it's very important for policymakers to have a good understanding what's going on these platforms. But platforms are not enough. You also need offline meetings, and offline meetings are held in Amsterdam in this warehouse building, Pakhuis. It's a warehouse that's being refurbished, and we organize there many interesting city talks about redesigning the city, how to reshape some neglected neighborhoods. And policymakers came here, SMEs. It's a very nice hybrid meeting with very different groups. This is a City Hall evidence on platform. This is actually the subway reconstruction information side. I wouldn't call it participatory. It's more like two-sided communication portal where citizens can actually upload their picture if they are unsatisfied that they have cracks in their houses or they perceive some complaints about the subway. But it's already a good step ahead that we are moving towards being platform slowly. And this is where I worked last 2 years, Commons for Europe. This is a European project, actually CIP co-funded project that I conceived very, very successful, working with the coders that are temporarily hired for city halls, and they can inject technology in a very gentle, soft way that is not actually threatening, but they bring knowledge, very interesting knowledge, and it's not just like building civic apps, but it's much more like questioning the legacy, like why we are still working with Explorer instead of Firefox or other internet providers. So in Code for Europe, we actually produced Europe Commons, and that's a very interesting app store. And I think this is the future where cities are moving, that we're going to share civic apps, codes, that we don't produce the codes from the scratch on, but we just actually localize the interface and we use the code, and that will save lots of energy and effort. In the other European projects, we were also experimenting with the value of crowdsourcing platform, how to launch a crowdsourcing platform. We noticed that it was very important to have a face when you go into the public and to have concrete interactions. We collected 400 ideas. We have 240 civic innovators. This was a very nice example about finding a new name for a kind of therapist that is dealing with youth that are on the street and unemployed. And this was a contest, and we see there a politician committed, and that was a very important step to generate ideas. This is also about a competition where we try to make cities smarter and how to capture on better solutions. 4 cities participated. This was also a very nice experiment. We actually give awards, incentives, a bicycle. We also have another different platforms, and these are more petition collectors. In Amsterdam, it's very active. If you actually object political decisions, you sign up for petitions. But actually, the problem with this petition collector that it's not tapped into the city hall yet. You can't really move forward. We also have local crowdsourcing platforms, but the problem is that they are very scattered. They're just being implemented in one district. It's very difficult to scale them up. However, they do really amazing things like making marathons, making local markets. But the problem is that it's not, the city scale is still missing. What I mentioned, the change bias, that to me this is a beautiful example of open source crowdsourcing platform that is very easy to transfer to other cities. And it's already, you see, it's being replicated. For example, in Lisbon, they use the same interface for participatory budgeting, where the city hall actually defrosted €1 million and asked the citizens what would like to do for your city, and they chose for several projects like open Wi-Fi. So if it comes to platforms, I say always yes, we should do it, but very carefully. We should look at the market, what is possible, and we should definitely generate policy commitment first. Give incentives, and I also advocate very much for the harmonized interfaces, make use of actually interoperable interfaces for apps. What is also important actually for cities to tap into a tech society that is for us unknown, like for example Open Knowledge Foundation, ODI, try to get out of the boundaries of the city hall to test technology, because cities are really just being attacked almost with many corporate offers to buy systems. So this is for me also worrying, actually, how many corporate offers are around and how unthoughtful cities are buying in. Cities are very vulnerable, and therefore I always call for a very good collaboration for smart geeks, techies that help cities to choose the best. So what would be my desire for the next years is to create a new layer in City Hall that are actually kind of interface of people that are operating in between tech societies and developers, and they understand the value of open standards and open data, and they can work also a bit more experimental and entrepreneurial. Thank you so much.
Nearly went flying there. We have a few minutes for discussion. So we'll kick off, and if you have any questions, please get those ready. Just to warm us up, I'll kick off. One of the threads that came out a few times there was how to do these kind of bottom-up initiatives at scale. And also a thread that we've looked at FutureEverything previously is how to get beyond a simplistic us versus them with bottom-up and top-down. Yesterday we heard Golden Levin talking about closed stacks, proprietary systems that are locked and aren't open to innovation. And here we've heard a focus on bottom-up. One difference in the smart citizen implementation in Amsterdam and Manchester is in Manchester we're working in collaboration with Intel and very much seeking to get that seam and that collaboration going as a real driver for the project. Just wondered if any of the speakers here had any thoughts on that. Is that part of the answer to scale up? Are there some success stories? Where do we see those kinds of collaborations where different kinds of actors come together to help these kind of initiatives scale?
People are looking at me, unfortunately. So I think there's this interesting question about when do you need to scale and when don't you need to scale. There's this instinctive thought, I think, that bottom-up needs to scale up. And that clearly needn't be the case at all. Equally, as I tried to point out, there are a bunch of decisions you do need to make at scale for certain kinds of systems. We might, let's say, healthcare or transport. Most of the decisions there might need to have a certain scale to them. Transport in particular is an easy one to think about. Many cities are hampered through an inability to think of it at scale. Actually, Sydney is a great example. It has a light rail system which only has one line and didn't get built any further. It has a monorail which goes around the middle and didn't go any further. They had to tear it down. So those kind of fragmented decisions also occur at that scale. But we know that to make fully multimodal integrated decisions, you probably need something a bit like Transport for London, for instance. So that is that's a very typical top-down culture, actually, which is kind of interesting, but perhaps works quite well for that. What it doesn't work so well for is necessarily generating an app like CityMapper, which in London at least has made London navigable and is probably on half the smartphones in London and has been built on the back of the Journey Planner API, one way or another, possibly some of your work there as well, Foursquare and various mapping technologies and so on. And they struggle when they talk to TfL about being heard as a developer. So it's something that we're looking to knit together is, again, similar to the work that Emer's doing, I think, which is how do you help cities understand what a developer community is so that you can get that kind of innovation like CityMapper, which can go from nothing to half the smartphones in London in about 6 months, 12 months, which is clearly beneficial to London, and it's based on some top-down decisions, if you like, about Transport for London data. So these things are always an interplay between them. I think it's far more complex than we usually have the right language for. Often in the open source world, there's that dichotomy of Robert Moses and Jane Jacob. Jacob needed Moses and vice versa to some extent, and New York is an outcome of both of them. So, whether it's in Greenwich Village, which is more Jacob's territory, or the parks, which is more Robert Moses, they both added value in different ways. And I think we need to understand the interplay of those things, because it's complex. But I think that core question of what scale do you need to make the decision at is perhaps the interesting thing to flip back on us. When you see all of those bottom-up innovations in Amsterdam, it's kind of amazing. And at the same time, when I said this about a year ago, Bruce Sterling took me to task, as he often does, anybody, for saying, sometimes I just want to be a passive citizen. I don't want to be active all the time, engaging in all these things. I just want the city to work, and I want to get on with my life, cooking a meal, watching the football, whatever it is. So there's a kind of a weight of explosion in the bottom-up area, which we do need to think about, well, how does that corral together into something a bit more coherent? And at what point do we need to make a larger decision, and what point we need to make a smaller decision? That's what I'd rather talk about, as opposed to whether it's bottom-up or top-down from a code platform point of view.
Okay. Any questions from the floor? We have one here. We have a mic. Any more questions? We only have a short time now before the next panel.
Somebody over there, Drew. The lady over there.
Hello.
Ask a question.
Okay.
Hi. So, brilliant, really interesting talks from all three of you. I think the thing that was missing, curiously, from all of them, was the role of representative democracy in the city. I spent quite a lot of time as a local newspaper journalist in not very nice areas of towns not far from here, and I really developed a great sense of respect for the local councillors who are on the ground, being involved as a transmission layer between the citizen who just wants stuff to work and the bureaucracy of City Hall. I wonder what's the role of those people in this world?
Can I answer that? Yeah. I would say, in my experience, in trying to get data released, in fact, local politicians and certainly the mayor and City Hall were far less risk-averse about opening data than their public officials, which is kind of ironic because they've got to knock on doors for their jobs every 4 years. So you would think if something's going to go wrong or, there's an issue around data, they have more to lose. But actually, I think they demonstrate more commitment to being closer to what the citizen requires. So I think they have a huge role to play in being very strong advocates for transparency and open governance. And I think if we had more of that visibility at a political level, because it is a political issue, and public officials are very finely attuned to politics, right? And so I think, that kind of leadership is going to make it happen more quickly. So I think they have a vital role to play, absolutely crucial.
Okay, thank you. A question down here?
Following up from that question, working quite a lot with the high street environment and people who try to make the high street better, we've noticed there's a very big discrepancy between trying to work out the complexity of the cities and the complexity of the high street. They sort of divorced, and when you talk to people on the ground, the councillors, people who are actually on the coal face of trying to make cities better, there is a big disconnect between what the current government is trying to do and what people on the ground are trying to do. How are we going to address that, and what are we going to do with the population that lives out of the cities and is left out of the conversations entirely? I've just been to one of the smaller cities and mentioned open source, and they just look at me like I was coming from the moon. So I think we have to really look for the answers, how we're going to explain it to people, make the return of investment palatable, and catch it before it's too late, before it's seen as luxury.
Yeah, please.
I think it's very important to make user consultations, and also when we arrange hackathons, it's very important to interact with the developers to capture what are actually the most demanded data sets. And if they can demonstrate, then you can go to the City Hall and try to negotiate. But I think these kind of sessions are completely new for us because generally the city is not so user-oriented, and if we arrange this kind of informal sessions, that can lead us further, also with some good demonstration, what kind of future app could be done. And what I see, what problem in transport data, it's often not the unwillingness of City Hall, but it's more like the scattered decision-making and the departments that are responsible for different stream of transport data. And if we can make them talk with each other, it's already a big step ahead.
Does anyone else have anything to add about the high street and the different types of actors?
What it's really about, it's going back to Dan's point, it's about a reform of government. So this starts as a discussion about technology and open data, but actually what it's about is reconfiguring how government is provided. And part of that is going back to a situation which has been largely lost in local government, where you have everybody who's at the top paid vast amount of money, people on the front line who are doing the most critical work paid so little, or it's outsourced, and nobody's listening to them, and they're the people who are closest. So it's about a reprovisioning of that, just as much as it is about reprovisioning of your attitude towards risk. So you may very well find in the big lie of strategic planning that somebody further up in this stream has an idea about what should happen on the high street, okay? But actually it's the people who are working on the high street, who are living on the high street, who are dealing with that, who have the better understanding of that. And the example I gave yesterday was, it's that approach to focus groups where Sony are releasing their new MP3s in various colors, and they call everybody together and they say, could you tell us what you think? And they say, oh, I like the pink and I like the red. And at the end they say, well, to say thanks to you for coming, you can all take one home, and everybody picks black. Okay? Because those kind of focus, that kind of strategic sort of view, instead of looking at what's actually happening on the street. What are the pressing problems that need to be addressed?
So just on the high street again, I think it is this sense of we need a new way of vocabulary, almost for thinking about the way that we make decisions. So the high street is a local environment and probably works very well for many things to be managed at that level. And we currently don't enable that because we have a spatial organization of our government. And we had something which was more flow-based, for instance. It might make more sense, particularly as we're now trying to think about how those flows can be more effective or more interesting or more beneficial. I think the issue is separating them out. So logistics, for instance, might well have to be done at the much bigger scale around the high street, because we have the issue that retail delivery is destroying many of our cities now. And not just high street, but online retail. In a major building in London, 2/3 of the deliveries going into the loading dock are Amazon deliveries for employees within them. So they're not to do with the business, if you like, of the building, but they're Amazon deliveries, they're parcels for employees. All of those are in little vans dotting around, and that's a completely fragmented marketplace. So how do we begin to address that? It can only happen at a scale of a city or a large region, micro-consolidation centres, e-cargo bikes, all kinds of possibilities. We need to knit them together at that scale. When it comes to the urban realm itself on the high street, that is a local decision. So that needs to be separated out. We're not very good at separating out these flows, for instance. We tend to just think of a spatial boundary, which again is a very 19th century way of thinking about it.
Yesterday we heard that a healthy city was a city where things are made locally. I would say a healthy high street would be a high street with local traders working there, and you can map that same discussion onto the kinds of local services. I think if we support innovation and enable market stall holders or small independent shops or cafes to participate in that and see those as natural stakeholders alongside other citizen groups, then we give the opportunity for local bespoke solutions on the high street or in communities. I think we're out of time. Some very interesting threads there, which I'm sure we can pick up elsewhere. Could you please join me in thanking an excellent panel?